The rain hammered against the windows of the cramped law office on the third floor of a deteriorating building in downtown Boston, its rhythmic patter almost drowning out the heated argument taking place within. Michael Harrison, barely 28 years old, with idealistic eyes that hadn't yet been dulled by the harsh realities of the legal system, sat across from his mentor, veteran attorney Robert Kellerman, whose weathered face told the story of 3 decades battling in America's courtrooms. "You're making a mistake, Michael," Kellerman said, his gravelly voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "This case will destroy your career before it even begins. The defendant is toxic, the evidence is circumstantial at best, and public opinion has already convicted him. Walk away while you still can." Michael shifted uncomfortably in his worn leather chair, the springs creaking under his slight frame. Outside, Boston was experiencing one of the wettest springs in recent memory, and the persistent dampness seemed to seep into everything, including his resolve. He had graduated from Harvard Law School with honors just 2 years prior, full of dreams about fighting injustice and defending the innocent. Now, faced with his first major case, those dreams felt more like naive fantasies. "Robert, you taught me that every person deserves proper legal representation, regardless of public opinion or political pressure," Michael replied, his voice steadier than he felt. "How can I turn my back on that principle now?" The case in question involved Marcus Williams, a 24-year-old African-American Vietnam veteran who had been charged with the armed robbery of a convenience store in South Boston. The incident had occurred during a particularly tense period in the city's history, with racial tensions running high following the implementation of court-ordered school busing. The media had seized upon the story, painting Williams as another example of the social decay that many attributed to the civil rights movement and changing demographics. Michael had been assigned to the case through the public defender's office, where he worked part-time while building his private practice. The moment he read Williams' file, something had struck him as fundamentally wrong. The witness testimonies contained inconsistencies. The physical evidence was sparse, and the investigating officers had a documented history of problematic arrests in minority communities. Yet every attorney he consulted advised him to push for a plea bargain and move on. "This isn't about principles, son," Kellerman continued, pouring himself another cup of coffee from the perpetually brewing pot that sat on his cluttered desk. "This is about survival. You think you can change the system by taking on hopeless cases. All you'll do is mark yourself as a troublemaker, and no respectable firm will touch you." The older attorney's office reflected his pragmatic approach to law. The walls were lined with diplomas, bar certifications, and photographs from various legal conferences, but notably absent were any awards for civil rights work or pro bono service. Kellerman had built his reputation defending white-collar criminals and settling personal injury cases, carefully avoiding the controversial matters that might alienate potential clients. Michael stood and walked to the rain-streaked window, gazing down at the bustling street below. Boston in 1974 was a city in transition, caught between its revolutionary past and an uncertain future. The old Irish and Italian neighborhoods were being challenged by demographic changes, while the universities continued to attract young idealists like himself who believed they could make a difference. The contradiction between America's founding principles and its current realities had never felt more apparent. "I met with Williams yesterday," Michael said finally. "He's not what the newspapers are portraying. He served 2 tours in Vietnam, came home to find his neighborhood destroyed by urban renewal, and has been struggling with nightmares and drinking. But he's not a criminal, Robert. I can see it in his eyes." Kellerman sighed heavily, setting down his coffee cup with a sharp clink against the saucer. "Michael, you're letting emotion cloud your judgment. Half the men in this city have similar stories, and some of them do commit crimes. Your job isn't to be a social worker or a psychiatrist. It's to provide competent legal representation within the bounds of what's possible. But what if what's possible isn't enough? What if the system is so biased that competent representation becomes meaningless? Then you do your best and move on to the next case. That's how the law works, son. It's not perfect, but it's what we have. Michael turned back to face his mentor, his jaw set with determination that reminded Kellerman uncomfortably of his own younger self. I can't accept that, Robert. If we don't challenge the system when it's clearly failing, who will? The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the office door. Kellerman's secretary, Mrs. Patterson, entered with a stack of phone messages and a troubled expression. Mr. Kellerman, there have been several calls about Mr. Harrison's case. 2 from reporters, 1 from someone claiming to represent community leaders in South Boston, and 1 from Judge Morrison's clerk. Michael felt his stomach tighten. Judge Morrison was known for running a tight courtroom where defense attorneys who caused problems found themselves facing increasingly difficult rulings. The fact that he was already taking notice of the case suggested that pressure was being applied at the highest levels. What did Judge Morrison's clerk want? Michael asked. He suggested that you might benefit from a meeting with the judge to discuss proper courtroom decorum, Mrs. Patterson replied diplomatically. Kellerman shook his head grimly. You see, it's already starting. Morrison is giving you a chance to fall in line before the trial begins. If you ignore his warning, he'll make your life miserable in that courtroom. Michael spent the rest of the afternoon reviewing Williams' case file, searching for any detail that might have been overlooked by the investigating officers or prosecutors. The arrest report described a straightforward armed robbery. Williams had allegedly entered Murphy's Corner store at approximately 9:30 p.m. on a Tuesday evening, brandished a knife, and demanded money from the elderly proprietor, Sean Murphy. According to the police report, Murphy had activated a silent alarm, and officers arrived to find Williams fleeing the scene with $43 in cash. However, as Michael dug deeper, inconsistencies began to emerge. The responding officers claimed they had spotted Williams running from the store, but their patrol car had been positioned 3 blocks away when the alarm was triggered. The timeline suggested they would have had to travel through heavy evening traffic in less than 2 minutes to witness Williams' alleged escape. Additionally, Murphy's initial description of the robber's height and build didn't match Williams's physical characteristics, and the store's cash register showed a discrepancy that predated the alleged robbery by several days. Most troubling was Williams's alibi. He claimed to have been at a Veterans Administration counseling session until 9:45 p.m., followed by drinks with fellow veterans at a nearby bar. Michael had contacted the VA counselor, who confirmed Williams's attendance, but noted that the session had run longer than usual due to Williams's obvious distress about employment difficulties and recurring nightmares from his combat experiences. As evening approached, Michael made a decision that would define not only this case but the trajectory of his entire career. He called Williams at the county jail and arranged for an extended interview the following morning. If he was going to defend this man, he needed to understand not just the facts of the case, but the human being behind the charges. The rain had finally stopped when Michael left Kellerman's office, but the streets remained slick with moisture that reflected the neon signs and streetlights in shimmering patterns. Boston's evening rush hour created a symphony of car horns, footsteps, and distant conversations as workers hurried home to suburban refugees far from the city's growing problems. Walking to his car, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing at a crossroads. The safe path led toward compromise, plea bargains, and a gradual accommodation with a flawed but established system. The other path promised conflict, uncertainty, and possibly the destruction of his legal career before it had truly begun. But as he drove through the city streets, passing neighborhoods where the American dream felt more like a distant fantasy than an achievable goal, Michael realized that some choices transcended personal considerations. Marcus Williams deserved more than an attorney who was primarily concerned with avoiding controversy. He deserved someone willing to fight for truth, even when that truth was unwelcome. The next morning would bring new challenges and revelations that would test Michael's resolve in ways he couldn't yet imagine. But tonight, sitting in his modest apartment reviewing case files by lamplight, he felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a mantle he was not entirely sure he was ready to wear. The Suffolk County Jail squatted like a concrete monument to human failing in the heart of Boston, its brutalist architecture serving as a daily reminder that justice in America often wore a harsh face. Michael Harrison arrived early on a crisp October morning, the autumn air carrying hints of the coming winter and the distant aroma of coffee from nearby diners where courthouse regulars gathered to discuss cases and gossip about judicial politics. The interview room was stark and unwelcoming, furnished with only a metal table and two uncomfortable chairs beneath flickering fluorescent lights that cast everything in an unflattering pale glow. Michael spread his legal pad and pen on the scratched surface, trying to project confidence despite the knot of anxiety in his stomach. This conversation would either confirm his instincts about Williams's innocence or force him to confront the possibility that his idealism had clouded his professional judgment. Marcus Williams entered flanked by two corrections officers, his movements careful and deliberate, in a way that spoke of military training still ingrained after years of civilian life. He was taller than Michael had expected, with broad shoulders that filled out his orange jumpsuit and intelligent eyes that surveyed the room with the alertness of someone accustomed to evaluating potential threats. The handcuffs around his wrists seemed absurdly heavy for a man who had volunteered to serve his country in one of America's most unpopular wars. "Mr. Harrison," Williams said as he settled into his chair, his voice carrying traces of a southern accent that spoke of origins far from Boston's urban landscape. "I appreciate you taking my case. Most lawyers I've talked to seem more interested in getting me to plead guilty than finding out what really happened." Michael studied his client's face, noting the fatigue that shadowed his eyes and the slight tremor in his hands that might have been withdrawal from alcohol or simply the physical manifestation of stress. "Marcus, I need you to understand something from the beginning. I'm going to fight for you, but I need complete honesty. If you're guilty, we can work toward the best possible outcome. If you're innocent, we're going to prove it, regardless of how difficult that might be." Williams leaned back slightly, his expression shifting from cautious hope to something approaching relief. "Mr. Harrison, I've been in combat situations where I thought I might die, but I've never been as scared as I am right now. When people look at me, they see everything they're afraid of about what America is becoming. A black veteran who can't find steady work, who drinks too much, who doesn't fit into their idea of what a hero should look like." "Tell me about that Tuesday evening," Michael said gently. "Everything you remember from when you left work until you were arrested." Williams' account emerged slowly, interrupted by long pauses as he struggled to recall details through the haze of alcohol and emotional distress that had characterized much of his recent life. He had been working construction jobs sporadically, finding that many employers were reluctant to hire veterans returning from an increasingly unpopular war. The Tuesday in question had been particularly difficult, as he had been laid off from a project due to what his supervisor called budget constraints, though Williams suspected his race and military service had made him an easy target for elimination. "I went to the VA office for my counseling session," Williams continued, his voice growing steadier as the story progressed. "Dr. Patricia Hendricks was my counselor, and she always ran late because she actually listened to what we were saying. I've been having nightmares about Vietnam, flashbacks during the day, and she was helping me understand that what I was experiencing wasn't weakness or failure, but a normal response to abnormal situations." Michael made detailed notes, recognizing that Dr. Hendricks' testimony would be crucial to establishing Williams' whereabouts during the alleged robbery. However, he also understood that introducing evidence about his client's psychological struggles might create prejudice among jurors who viewed mental health issues as character flaws rather than medical conditions. After the counseling session, I met Tommy Rodriguez and James Mitchell at O'Malley's Tavern, Williams continued. They were also veterans, guys I'd gotten to know through the VA programs. We usually had a few beers and talked about things that people who hadn't been over there wouldn't understand. The choice of O'Malley's struck Michael as significant. The tavern was located in a predominantly Irish neighborhood where black customers were not always welcome, yet Williams and his friends had apparently become regulars. This suggested either remarkable tolerance on the part of the establishment's patrons, or that the three veterans had earned respect through some combination of military service and personal character. "How many drinks did you have?" Michael asked, knowing that Williams' alcohol consumption would inevitably become an issue during trial. Williams hesitated, clearly aware of the implications of his answer. 3 beers? Maybe 4. I wasn't drunk, Mr. Harrison, if that's what you're asking. I was tired and frustrated, but I knew exactly what I was doing and where I was. What time did you leave O'Malley's? Around 10:30. Tommy and James stayed later, but I had to be up early the next morning for a job interview. I walked home through the common because it was a nice evening and I wanted to clear my head. Michael's pen stopped moving. The timing created a significant problem for the prosecution's case. If Williams had been at O'Malley's until 10:30, he could not have committed a robbery at Murphy's Corner store at 9:30, assuming the witnesses were telling the truth about their recollections. Marcus, this is important. Are you absolutely certain about the timing? Could you have left O'Malley's earlier than you remember? Williams shook his head firmly. The Red Sox game was on television, and it went into extra innings. We watched the whole thing, and it didn't end until after 10:15. I remember because Tommy bet me $5 that Carlton Fisk would get the winning hit, and when he struck out, Tommy bought the next round to pay off the debt. Michael felt a surge of excitement. Baseball games were precisely timed events with extensive documentation. If he could prove that the Red Sox game had indeed gone into extra innings on the night in question, and if the bartender or other witnesses could confirm Williams's presence during the game's conclusion, it would provide an unshakable alibi. Have you told this to anyone else? The police, other lawyers, anyone? I tried to tell the arresting officers, but they weren't interested in hearing explanations. They seemed to have already decided I was guilty. One of them, Officer Kowalski, kept saying that guys like me always had excuses but never took responsibility for our actions. The interview continued for another hour, with Williams providing detailed descriptions of his route home, the people he had encountered, and his shock when police officers had surrounded him just 2 blocks from his apartment. The arrest had been swift and aggressive, with little opportunity for explanation or questioning. As Michael prepared to leave, Williams gripped his arm with surprising intensity. "Mr. Harrison, I need you to understand something. I've done things in Vietnam that I'm not proud of, things that were necessary in combat but that haunt me every day. But I have never stolen from anyone, and I would never threaten an elderly man trying to make a living. Whatever you think of me, whatever problems I have with drinking or nightmares, I am not the man who robbed that store." Walking back to his car through Boston's busy streets, Michael felt the weight of his client's words settling into his consciousness. The city around him seemed different somehow, as if he were seeing it through the eyes of someone who had been marginalized by the very society he had served. Young professionals hurried past without making eye contact. Police officers eyed him with casual suspicion, and the comfortable certainties of his middle-class upbringing felt suddenly fragile. That afternoon, Michael began the painstaking process of investigating his client's alibi. He called the Boston Globe's sports department and requested information about Red Sox games from early October. Learning that the team had indeed played a 13-inning game on the night in question, exactly as Williams had described, He then visited O'Malley's Tavern, where the Irish bartender Sean O'Brien remembered the three veterans as regular customers who always paid their tabs and never caused trouble. "Those boys have been through hell," O'Brien told Michael over the din of afternoon regulars. "They don't talk much about what they saw over there, but you can see it in their eyes. They stick together, and they look out for each other." Marcus was here that night, same as always, nursing his beer and watching the game. By evening, Michael had compiled a timeline that cast serious doubt on the prosecution's case. Williams had been in counselling until nearly 10 o'clock, had remained at O'Malley's until after 10:30, and had been arrested while walking home around 11:15. The alleged robbery had occurred at 9:30, making it physically impossible for Williams to be the perpetrator. However, Michael also understood that alibi evidence, no matter how compelling, might not be sufficient to overcome the prejudices his client faced. In a city still struggling with racial tensions and the cultural upheaval of the Vietnam War, Marcus Williams represented everything that made many Americans uncomfortable about the direction of their country. As he sat in his apartment that evening, reviewing his notes and preparing for the challenges ahead, Michael realized that this case would test not only his legal skills, but also his faith in the American justice system itself. The evidence strongly suggested his client's innocence, but whether that innocence could be proven in a courtroom dominated by prejudice and political pressure remained an open question. The courthouse steps were slick with morning dew when Michael arrived for what would become the most important pre-trial hearing of his young career. Fall in Boston carried the promise of harsh winters ahead, and the grey sky seemed to mirror the grim mood that had settled over the city as the Williams case gained national attention. Protesters had begun gathering outside the courthouse, some demanding justice for Marcus Williams, while others called for law and order in a city they believed was spiraling toward chaos. Judge Harrison Morrison's courtroom was a study in old-world authority, with dark wood paneling, high ceilings, and an elevated bench that made the judge appear to tower over everyone else in the room. Morrison himself was a product of Boston's legal establishment, a Harvard-educated jurist whose father had served on the Massachusetts Supreme Court and whose connections extended deep into the city's political infrastructure. His reputation for maintaining order came with an unspoken understanding that defense attorneys who challenged his authority did so at their own peril. Michael had spent the previous week preparing his motion to suppress evidence, arguing that the police investigation had been so fundamentally flawed that much of the prosecution's case should be excluded from trial. He knew it was a long shot, but the inconsistencies in witness statements and the suspicious circumstances of Williams' arrest demanded judicial scrutiny. District Attorney Patricia Connolly represented the prosecution, her presence in the courtroom a clear signal that the case had political implications, extending far beyond a simple armed robbery charge. Connolly was positioning herself for a run for state attorney general, and her tough-on-crime rhetoric played well with voters who viewed rising crime rates as evidence of social breakdown. She had made Williams' case a symbol of her administration's commitment to protecting law-abiding citizens from what she characterized as the growing threat of urban violence. "Your Honor," Michael began, his voice carrying more confidence than he felt, "the evidence will show that my client was arrested based on a misidentification that occurred under circumstances that should raise serious questions about the reliability of the eyewitness testimony." Mr. Murphy, the alleged victim, initially described his attacker as approximately 5 feet 8 inches tall, with a thin build. "My client is 6 feet 2 inches tall and weighs 210 pounds. Judge Morrison's expression remained neutral, but Michael could sense his impatience with what the judge likely viewed as typical defense attorney tactics. "Mr. Harrison, eyewitness testimony can vary due to stress and poor lighting conditions. Unless you have evidence of deliberate perjury, I'm not inclined to exclude testimony based on minor descriptive inconsistencies." "Your Honor, these are not minor inconsistencies." Additionally, the responding officers claim they observed my client fleeing the scene, but their patrol car was positioned more than 3 blocks away when the silent alarm was triggered. Given traffic conditions and the layout of the streets, it would have been impossible for them to arrive quickly enough to witness the alleged escape. DA Connolly rose to respond, her tailored suit and confident demeanor projecting the authority of someone accustomed to winning. Your Honor, the defense is attempting to create confusion where none exists. The officers responded quickly to a crime in progress and observed a suspect matching the general description provided by Mr. Murphy. The defendant was found in possession of $43 in cash, which matches exactly the amount reported stolen. Michael felt his jaw tighten. Your Honor, my client had just been paid for a construction job and can provide documentation showing that he legitimately possessed that money. Furthermore, the store's cash register showed discrepancies that predated the alleged robbery by several days, suggesting that the $43 may not have been stolen at all. The hearing continued for 2 hours, with Michael methodically presenting evidence of the investigation's flaws, while DA Connolly dismissed each concern as defense lawyer misdirection. Judge Morrison listened with growing irritation, occasionally interrupting Michael's arguments with pointed questions that seemed designed more to discourage than to clarify. "Mr. Harrison," the judge finally said, his voice carrying unmistakable warning, "I've heard enough. Your client was identified by the victim, observed fleeing by police officers, and found in possession of money matching the amount reported stolen. While you raise interesting theoretical concerns about the investigation, I find no evidence of misconduct sufficient to warrant suppressing evidence. Your motion is denied." As court recessed, Michael felt the sting of his first major defeat, but worse was the realization that the judge's decision seemed predetermined. Morrison had barely considered the evidence Michael presented, treating the hearing more as an inconvenient formality than a genuine examination of potential constitutional violations. Outside the courtroom, Michael was approached by Sarah Chen, a reporter from the Boston Globe who had been covering the case with unusual depth and nuance. Unlike many journalists who seemed content to repeat prosecution talking points, Chen had actually investigated the circumstances of Williams' arrest and found many of the same inconsistencies that troubled Michael. "Mr. Harrison, do you have a comment on Judge Morrison's ruling?" "I'm disappointed but not surprised," Michael replied carefully. "We'll continue fighting for Mr. Williams at trial, where a jury will have the opportunity to evaluate all the evidence, not just the portions that support the prosecution's narrative." Chen nodded, scribbling notes in her ever-present notepad. "I've been looking into the responding officers' backgrounds. Did you know that Officers Kowalski and Martinez have been involved in several questionable arrests in minority communities over the past 2 years?" Michael felt a surge of interest, but forced himself to maintain professional discretion. "I can't comment on ongoing investigations, but I would encourage you to continue your excellent reporting on this case." That afternoon, Michael met with Dr. Patricia Hendricks at the VA Medical Center, where she provided counseling services to Vietnam veterans. The building was a monument to bureaucratic efficiency, with endless corridors lined with industrial carpeting and fluorescent lighting that seemed designed to drain hope from anyone who entered. Dr. Hendricks was a small woman in her 40s, with prematurely grey hair and eyes that reflected the emotional weight of listening to combat veterans describe experiences most civilians couldn't imagine. Her office was filled with certificates, medical journals, and photographs from various conferences on post-traumatic stress, a field that was just beginning to gain recognition in mainstream medical practice. "Mr. Harrison, I want to help Marcus in any way I can," she began, settling behind her desk with William's thick treatment file. "He's been struggling with what we're starting to understand as post-traumatic stress disorder, though the medical establishment has been slow to recognize it as a legitimate condition rather than a character weakness. Can you describe his mental state on the evening of October 8th? Dr. Hendricks consulted her detailed notes. Marcus was particularly distressed that day. He had lost another job, largely due to employer prejudices against Vietnam veterans, and was experiencing increased frequency of nightmares and flashbacks. Our session ran longer than usual because he was having difficulty processing his anger and frustration. Was he capable of committing a violent crime? Absolutely not. Marcus has never shown any tendency toward violence outside of his military service, and his psychological profile indicates someone with strong moral boundaries and deep respect for civilian authority. The idea that he would threaten an elderly man is completely inconsistent with everything I know about his character. Michael spent an hour with Dr. Hendricks, learning about the unique challenges facing Vietnam veterans in a society that seemed determined to forget their service and sacrifice. The conversation left him with a deeper understanding of his client's struggles, but also with growing anger at a system that seemed designed to criminalize the very people it had sent to fight an unpopular war. Returning to his office, Michael found Robert Kellerman waiting with an expression of grim concern. His mentor had been monitoring the case's progression with increasing alarm, watching his protégé venture into territory that threatened not only Michael's career, but potentially his physical safety. "Michael, we need to talk," Kellerman said without preamble. "I've been getting calls from people who matter in this city, and they're not happy with how you're handling this case." "What kind of people?" "The kind who can make or break legal careers. Judges, senior partners at major firms, city officials who control government contracts. They think you're turning a simple robbery case into a racial circus that's damaging Boston's reputation." Michael felt his temper rising. "So I'm supposed to throw my client under the bus to protect Boston's reputation? What about justice, Robert? What about the Constitution?" Kellerman sighed heavily, pouring himself coffee from the pot that seemed to be permanently brewing in his office. "Justice is important, son, but it's not the only consideration. You're young, talented, and idealistic, but you're also naive about how the world works. Sometimes the greater good requires individual sacrifice. Whose greater good? And who gets to decide which individuals should be sacrificed? The people who run this city, this state, this country. They're not evil, Michael, but they have responsibilities that extend beyond any single case. Social stability, economic development, political order, these things matter too." Michael stood and walked to the window, looking down at the street where ordinary people went about their daily lives, most of them unaware that their society's fundamental promises were being debated in law offices and courtrooms throughout the city. He thought about Marcus Williams, sitting in a jail cell not because of evidence of his guilt, but because his innocence was inconvenient for people who had never met him. "Robert, I understand what you're trying to tell me, but I can't accept it. If we abandon our principles when they become inconvenient, then we never really had principles at all." His mentor nodded slowly, as if he had expected this response but hoped to be wrong. "Then you need to understand what you're up against, Michael. This isn't just about one case or one client. You're challenging a system that has worked for decades, and that system will defend itself." As evening descended on Boston, Michael prepared for a trial that would test not only his legal skills, but also his fundamental beliefs about American justice. The evidence of his client's innocence remained compelling, but the forces arrayed against them seemed increasingly formidable. The trial of Marcus Williams began on a grey November morning when Boston's streets were slick with the season's first snow, and the city seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of a verdict that many believed would define the boundaries of justice in a changing America. The courtroom was packed with spectators, reporters, and activists from both sides of the racial divide that had come to characterize the case in the public imagination. Michael arrived early, his normally confident demeanor shadowed by the weight of sleepless nights spent preparing for a trial he knew would determine not only his client's fate, but also the trajectory of his own career. The evidence supporting Williams' innocence remained strong, but the pre-trial rulings had stripped away many of his most effective arguments, leaving him to fight an uphill battle against institutional prejudice and political pressure. Marcus Williams entered the courtroom, flanked by bailiffs, his military bearing intact despite weeks of incarceration. He had lost weight during his time in jail, and his eyes carried the haunted quality of someone who had witnessed the gap between American ideals and American reality. He wore a ill-fitting suit that Michael had purchased from a downtown department store, trying to project respectability in a system that seemed determined to see him as a symbol of social decay rather than an individual deserving of justice. District Attorney Patricia Connolly's opening statement was a masterpiece of prosecutorial theatre, painting Williams as a dangerous veteran whose combat training had made him a threat to law-abiding citizens. She described the terror experienced by Sean Murphy, the elderly store owner who had worked 16-hour days to build his small business, only to have it threatened by a man she characterized as representing everything that frightened middle-class Americans about the changing nature of their society. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Connolly began, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to speaking for the community's collective sense of outrage. "The evidence will show that Marcus Williams entered Murphy's corner store on the evening of October 8th with the intention of stealing money that didn't belong to him. When confronted by Mr. Murphy, the defendant threatened him with a knife, creating a situation that could have resulted in serious injury or death." Michael studied the jury carefully, noting their reactions to Connolly's words. The 12 men and women represented a cross-section of Boston society, but their faces reflected the same mixture of fear and suspicion that had characterized public reaction to the case. Several jurors avoided making eye contact with Williams, as if his presence in their courtroom confirmed their worst fears about the direction their city was heading. When Michael rose to deliver his opening statement, he felt the weight of expectation and prejudice settling over the courtroom like a fog that obscured truth and justice. His voice was steady, but he could feel the skepticism of jurors who had already been influenced by weeks of media coverage, portraying his client as guilty. "Members of the jury, the evidence in this case will show that Marcus Williams is innocent of the charges against him. Not probably innocent, not innocent by reason of some technical legal defense, but actually and completely innocent of any wrongdoing." Michael paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "You will hear evidence that Mr. Williams was in a Veterans Administration counseling session until nearly 10 o'clock on the night in question, followed by documented time at O'Malley's Tavern watching a baseball game that didn't end until after 10:15. The prosecution wants you to believe that he somehow traveled across the city, committed a robbery at 9:30, and then returned to his normal activities without anyone noticing his absence. The trial proceeded with methodical precision, each witness adding layers to a story that became more complex with every passing hour. Sean Murphy took the stand as the prosecution's key witness, describing the robbery in vivid detail that left several jurors visibly shaken. Under D.A. Connolly's careful questioning, Murphy painted a picture of a terrifying encounter with a knife-wielding assailant who had threatened his life for $43 in cash. Michael's cross-examination revealed the inconsistencies that had troubled him from the beginning of the case. Murphy acknowledged that the lighting in his store had been poor, that he had been wearing reading glasses that affected his distance vision, and that the entire encounter had lasted less than 2 minutes. Most damaging to his identification was his admission that he had initially described his attacker as significantly shorter and thinner than Williams. "Mr. Murphy, you told Officer Kowalski that your attacker was approximately 5 feet 8 inches tall with a thin build. Is that correct?" Murphy shifted uncomfortably in the witness chair. "I was very frightened, Mr. Harrison. People sometimes appear different when you're scared. But Mr. Williams is 6 feet 2 inches tall and weighs over 200 pounds. That's a significant difference, isn't it?" "I suppose so, yes." The testimony of officers Kowalski and Martinez proved even more problematic for the prosecution. Under Michael's relentless questioning, both officers admitted that they had been positioned more than 3 blocks from Murphy's store when the silent alarm was triggered. Their claim to have witnessed Williams fleeing the scene became increasingly implausible as Michael introduced traffic patterns, response times, and geographic evidence that contradicted their account. Officer Kowalski, you testified that you observed my client running from Murphy's corner store at approximately 9:35 p.m. Is that correct? Yes, sir. And where was your patrol car positioned when you received the dispatch about the silent alarm? Kowalski consulted his notes, his confidence beginning to waver. We were on Tremont Street, near the Common. That's more than 12 blocks from Murphy's store, isn't it? I'm not sure of the exact distance. Michael introduced a detailed map of downtown Boston, forcing Kowalski to trace the route his patrol car would have taken to reach the crime scene. The exercise revealed that the officers would have had to navigate through heavy evening traffic, including several construction zones that had reduced major streets to single lanes. Officer Kowalski, even under ideal traffic conditions, it would have taken you at least 8 minutes to travel from your position on Tremont Street to Murphy's corner store. Yet you claim to have arrived in time to witness my client fleeing the scene just 5 minutes after the alarm was triggered. Can you explain this discrepancy? The officer's answer was evasive and unconvincing, creating visible doubt among several jurors who had been following Michael's questions with increasing interest. D.A. Connolly's objections grew more frequent and heated as the cross-examination continued, but Judge Morrison's rulings seemed designed more to hurry the proceedings along than to ensure thorough examination of the evidence. Dr. Patricia Hendricks' testimony provided crucial support for Williams' alibi, her detailed record showing that he had been in counseling until 9:52 p.m. on the night of the alleged robbery. Her description of Williams' mental state and character painted a picture completely at odds with the prosecution's portrayal of a dangerous criminal. Dr. Hendricks, in your professional opinion, would Mr. Williams be capable of committing the crime described in this case? Absolutely not. Marcus suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder related to his combat experiences, but his psychological profile shows someone with strong moral boundaries and deep respect for authority. The idea that he would threaten an elderly civilian is completely inconsistent with everything I know about his character and values. The bartender from O'Malley's Tavern, Sean O'Brien, provided the most compelling alibi testimony. His Irish accent and working-class demeanor seemed to resonate with several jurors as he described serving Williams and his friends during the crucial time period when the robbery had allegedly occurred. Mr. O'Brien, are you certain that Mr. Williams was in your establishment until after 10:30 on the evening of October 8th? Absolutely certain. The